The night sky over the Gulf of Venezuela was supposed to be empty, a quiet frontier where only fishermen, merchant vessels, and the rhythmic pulse of the Caribbean winds filled the darkness. But then came the roar, not loud enough for coastal towns to hear, but unmistakable to anyone watching radar screens. Two unidentified aircraft swept deep into Venezuelan airspace from the sea, their transponders silent, their paths deliberate, their timing perfect. What exactly was cutting across the Gulf at military speed, and why did the world only learn about it after the fact? Analysts would later confirm the truth. They were US Navy FA-18 Super Hornets call signs, Rhino 11 and Rhino 12, supported by a pair of EA-18G Growlers orbiting just beyond the northern boundary with an MQ-4C Triton drone gathering the wider picture from above. It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a drift. It was a message, one delivered with the precision of a scalpel, not the noise of a hammer, but a message to whom Nicolás Maduro, Washington's allies, or the global powers quietly watching this fragile region shift under the weight of a new US posture. The overflight lasted roughly 40 minutes, long enough to trigger alerts inside Venezuela's defense network, long enough for US intelligence to map those alerts, and long enough for the international community to grasp that something had changed. These were not reconnaissance drones or distant patrols. They were combat aircraft fighters and electronic warfare platforms capable of shaping an entire battle space within minutes. And they had entered an area Caracas considers one of its most sensitive maritime zones. What made the encounter even more alarming was its composition. Super Hornets do not simply observe. They bring standoff strike capability, advanced radar, and the flexibility to shift from air-to-air combat to precision ground attack mid-mission. Growlers aren't mere escorts. They specialize in cracking open an opponent's electronic shield, jamming radars, exposing communication links, and turning sophisticated defenses into open windows. And the MQ-4C Triton is the quiet eye in the sky that sees everything ships, aircraft, coastline movements, and signals traffic across hundreds of miles. Together they form a triad designed not for symbolism but for operational advantage. This wasn't a simple border test, it was a rehearsal of control of the air control of information control of escalation. Across diplomatic channels, governments reacted with caution. Brazil and Colombia monitored the situation closely, wary of spillover. China and Russia, Maduro's two largest military partners, scrutinized Washington's intentions. And in Washington itself, President Donald Trump's national security team remained silent, refusing to comment beyond acknowledging ongoing regional monitoring. But silence can be louder than words. In geopolitical signaling, what is not said often outweighs what is declared. Inside Venezuela, military commanders scrambled to understand the pattern. Was this merely reconnaissance, a test of reaction times, or the prelude to a new American strategy long whispered about but never openly executed? Some officers argued it was intimidation. Others feared it was preparation, an early stage of a pressure campaign shifting from diplomatic to kinetic. What cannot be ignored is the timing. The Super Hornets did not appear randomly. Their presence coincided with the movement of America's most formidable naval asset, the USS Gerald Ford aircraft carrier, driving steadily toward the Caribbean. Together, these signals suggest coordination rather than coincidence. And that leads to a final unsettling question. If this is the opening act, what comes next? The Gerald Ford's arrival in the Caribbean did not begin with dramatic headlines or presidential announcements. It began with a shadow on maritime tracking systems, a slow, deliberate turn southward. After departing St. Thomas, its battle group arrayed behind it like a steel constellation. To the untrained eye, it was simply another US Navy movement. But to defense analysts and foreign intelligence agencies, one truth became immediately clear. The world's most advanced aircraft carrier was closing distance with Venezuela, and carriers rarely move without purpose. The Ford is not just a ship, it is an ecosystem of power. Its decks hold more combat aircraft than some countries have in their entire air force. Its reactors grant it near limitless range. Its electromagnetic launch systems can hurl fighters skyward every 20 seconds. And its layered escorts, destroyers, cruisers, supply ships extend its eyes and weapons across air, sea, and undersea domains. When a carrier group of this magnitude sails toward a politically unstable region, questions surge like floodwaters. What is it preparing for? What options is Washington placing on the table? And why now? The timing could not be more consequential. Venezuela is politically fractured, economically suffocated, and militarily stretched. The regime is leaning more heavily than ever on Russian advisors, Iranian partnerships, and Chinese loans. In the midst of this vulnerability, a US strike group closing in feels less like routine patrol and more like strategic encirclement. And that perception matters. In geopolitics, reactions often grow from fear, not fact. As news of the carrier's course spread, defense ministries across Latin America activated watch protocols. Brazil, already dealing with spillover from Venezuelan border instability, quietly increased aerial surveillance. Colombia's military command raised alert levels, mindful of both insurgent flows and potential refugee surges in the event of a crisis. And in Havana and Managua, the two governments most sympathetic to Caracas state media began framing the deployment as an imperialist provocation. These narratives, whether grounded in truth or propaganda, shape political oxygen. Maduro's inner circle seized the moment, depicting the carrier's approach as proof of external aggression. Yet, behind closed doors, intelligence briefings painted a darker picture. The Ford's fighters, including the very Super Hornets spotted inside the Gulf of Venezuela, were now within operational reach of strategic sites across the northern coastline. At full tempo, the carrier could sustain continuous air operations day and night without relying on land bases. For Caracas, this meant that any misstep, any escalation, any misread signal could result in overwhelming American air power standing directly above its territory. Across the ocean, Washington presented a different frame. Officials described the deployment as a stabilizing measure, an assurance to allies, a deterrent against hostile actors, and a demonstration that the Western Hemisphere remains a priority under President Donald Trump. But the gap between official language and practical capability is vast. Stabilization can quickly shift into coercion when a fleet capable of striking dozens of targets simultaneously lies just over the horizon. What truly heightens tension is the combination of naval mobility and aerial precision. The Super Hornet flights over the Gulf were not isolated. They look increasingly like preparation calibration flights, testing distances, communications, electronic signatures, and Venezuelan reaction times. Growlers operating in tandem likely probe the country's radar network, mapping frequencies and identifying gaps. Meanwhile, the Triton's long-endurance scans knit the entire picture together into a mosaic of intelligence. Together, this signals intent not necessarily for war, but for readiness. The Caribbean has not seen a deployment of this scale in decades, and because of that, one unsettling question hangs over the hemisphere: is the Gerald Ford's presence merely pressure, or is it the quiet overture to a far larger confrontation? Long before the Super Hornets crossed into the Gulf of Venezuela, US planners had been assembling the kind of aerial triad that reveals far more through its presence than through its weapons. The combination of FA-18 Super Hornets, EA-18G Growlers, and an MQ-4C Triton drone is not improvised. It is a signature pattern, a blueprint the Pentagon uses when it wants to see everything shape everything and control everything in a contested environment. And the fact that this exact package appeared so close to Venezuelan territory suggests that Washington was doing far more than signaling. It was assessing, mapping, and preparing. The Super Hornet is often described as the backbone of America's carrier air wings, but in regions like the Caribbean, it is more than that. It is the spear. With advanced APG-79 radar, long-range AM-120 missiles, precision-guided strike weapons, and the agility to adapt mid-mission, the jet stands at the center of U.S. escalation dominance. When two of these aircraft flew nearly 40 minutes inside the Gulf, analysts instantly recognized the pattern. This was a probe, a test of Venezuelan sensors, command structures, and readiness. But the Super Hornets were only the visible edge. The real insight came from what accompanied them. The EA-18G Growler is the invisible hand of American air power. It jams radars before they know they're blind. It disrupts communications before commanders realize they've been isolated. And it maps electronic activity with a precision unmatched by any other aircraft in its class. When Growlers appear, the US is usually preparing for two possibilities: either a suppression of enemy air defense's mission, or a detailed diagnostic scan of an adversary's defensive architecture. In this case, the Growler's flight track, hovering just north of the Gulf of Venezuela, aligned almost perfectly with known Venezuelan radar fields, suggesting that Washington sought to understand exactly how Caracas sees, hears, and responds. But the most revealing piece of the triad was the MQ-4C Triton. Unlike the fighters, the Triton does not intimidate with speed. It dominates with endurance. Capable of remaining airborne for over 24 hours, the drone gathers a mosaic of maritime activity, ship movements, coastal deployments, radar emissions, and even the subtle electronic noise that betrays hidden installations. Its presence near Venezuela allowed US analysts to stitch together a full situational map, one that a single reconnaissance pass could never capture. In strategic terms, the Triton gives context, the Growler reveals weaknesses, and the Super Hornet demonstrates reach. Taken together, they form a coordinated intelligence package that precedes any major shift in posture. The same configuration has appeared in the South China Sea before freedom of navigation operations. It surfaced in Eastern Europe months before Russia escalated attacks in Ukraine, and it became routine over the Red Sea as Iran-backed militias tested international shipping lanes. The pattern is unmistakable. Where the US expects instability or intends to shape an outcome, this triad is the opening move. For Venezuela, the implications are profound. Every radar ping recorded by a Growler can inform future jamming. Every air defense activation triggered by the Super Hornet incursion becomes a data point. Every ship tracked by the Triton's sensors completes a picture of logistical routes, military bases, and vulnerabilities. This is not just pressure, it is preparation. Inside Washington, officials insist the flights were part of regional monitoring, but few believe this phrasing reflects the true scale of the operation. President Donald Trump has amplified a maximum pressure campaign against Nicolás Maduro, and these flights align perfectly with a strategy designed to tighten the noose without firing a shot. Yet behind the military choreography lies a deeper question: was the US merely testing Venezuela's defenses, or was it quietly shaping the battle space for a contingency still hidden from public view? The appearance of two US Air Force B-52 bombers in the same operational window as the Super Hornet's Growlers and the Triton drone transformed what looked like a regional probe into a global signal. B-52s are not instruments of subtlety. They are flying declaration strategic aircraft whose very presence hints at long-range strike capability, nuclear readiness, and political resolve. When they enter a theater already charged with tension, the world notices. And when they do so, while America's most advanced aircraft carrier approaches the same region, the message becomes unmistakable. Washington is communicating not only with Caracas, but with every major power watching the Western Hemisphere. The bomber tracks revealed through open source intelligence fit a familiar template. The US often deploys B-52s to convey strategic deterrence during moments of friction over the Korean Peninsula, when Pyongyang tests ballistic missiles across Eastern Europe, when Russia escalates in Ukraine, and in the Middle East when Iran threatens maritime routes or surrogate militias push against US positions. Their presence in the Caribbean mirrors this pattern precisely. The hemisphere has entered a moment where signals matter more than shots, and power projection becomes a language of its own. Just as significant as the aircraft themselves is the timing. The B-52 flights occurred days before the Super Hornet and Growler incursions, forming a ladder of escalation. First long-range strategic presence, then tactical reconnaissance, then electronic mapping. Combined, they reflect a broader logic pressure layered across altitude, distance, and domain. This is the choreography of modern American signaling heavyweight bombers to establish intent carrier-based fighters to demonstrate proximity, and electronic warfare platforms to quietly gather the data needed for any future decision. These signals reverberate far beyond Venezuela. In Kyiv, commanders recall that similar US patterns preceded Russia's 2022 invasion, when NATO intensified air patrols, reconnaissance flights, and bomber rotations to deter escalation. In Israel and Iran, shadow conflicts often ignite during periods when American strategic aviation shifts posture, each side interpreting deployments as clues of impending alignment or disengagement. And in the Indo-Pacific China study, every US bomber movement from Guam to Australia parsing the rhythms of strategic aviation to anticipate Washington's response to its maritime push in the South China Sea and around Taiwan. For Washington, the message is layered. To Maduro, it signals consequences. To allies in Latin America, it reassures that US commitment remains firm in an era crowded by Chinese loans, Russian military support, and Iranian partnerships. To global competitors, it demonstrates that America can still project overwhelming force in multiple regions simultaneously, even while managing crises elsewhere. But embedded within this show of power is a delicate paradox. The stronger the signal, the smaller the margin for miscalculation. Carriers, bombers, and electronic warfare aircraft compress the decision timeline. A radar operator misinterpreting a probe, a fighter scrambling too quickly, or a political leader responding emotionally could escalate a situation that neither side actually wants. Signals are powerful, but they are also dangerous when received through fear or distorted by propaganda. And yet, Washington appears prepared to take that risk. Under President Donald Trump, US's strategy leans heavily on visible strength high-profile deployments, rapid reaction forces, strategic aviation, and unmistakable threats designed to restore deterrence by overwhelming clarity. The Caribbean, long overshadowed by global flashpoints, has suddenly re-entered the center of American strategic messaging. The hemisphere is no longer a quiet backyard. It has become a stage on which broader geopolitical competitions play out. As the international community absorbs the implications of this synchronized deployment, one question lingers, one larger than Venezuela, larger than the carrier, larger even than the bombers themselves. Is this simply signaling or the first tremor of a new confrontation in a world already stretched thin by overlapping crises? For all the strategic maneuvers unfolding above the Caribbean, it is the people on the ground who feel the tension with the greatest immediacy. Venezuela, already battered by economic collapse, mass migration, food shortages, and political fragmentation, now faces the psychological weight of American military power gathering just beyond the horizon. When jets roar overhead or naval groups shift closer, it is not generals who panic. It is parents, workers, fishermen, and communities struggling to interpret what these movements might mean for their fragile daily lives. Inside coastal towns near the Gulf of Venezuela, the sight of low-flying aircraft, even unidentified ones, fuels rumors that spread faster than facts. Some whisper that the United States is preparing strikes. Others fear an embargo enforced by naval power. Many simply brace for another chapter of uncertainty. The memory of Venezuela's ongoing humanitarian exodus, more than 7 million citizens fleeing over recent years, hangs over every new development. Any military escalation, even symbolic, could trigger another wave of displacement, pushing thousands toward Brazil, Colombia, or perilous sea routes in makeshift boats. Within the Venezuelan armed forces, morale fractures along generational lines. Senior officers tied to the Maduro government interpret the U.S. deployment as a threat meant to destabilize the regime. Younger officers, however, view the American presence with a mixture of caution and quiet curiosity, aware that the nation's defensive infrastructure has deteriorated over years of corruption sanctions and resource depletion. When Super Hornets penetrated deep into the Gulf, some units responded sluggishly, not because of hesitation, but because equipment shortages and inconsistent training have eroded readiness. This disparity fuels anxiety. If the United States chose to escalate, Venezuela's ability to resist would be limited. Regional governments face their own dilemmas. Brazil grapples with a volatile border where illegal mining groups, smuggling networks, and paramilitary factions exploit state weakness in southern Venezuela. Colombia fears that any confrontation could push armed groups back across its frontier, complicating peace efforts. Caribbean states, historically cautious of great power rivalry, now worry that the arrival of the Gerald Ford carrier strike group will drag the region into a confrontation it cannot influence and cannot escape. For island economies dependent on shipping lanes, tourism, and fragile energy networks, even the perception of instability is damaging. Meanwhile, families across Venezuela live under the shadow of uncertainty. Power outages, inflation, and food scarcity already erode resilience. Now military overflights add a new layer of stress. Humanitarian organizations warn that a heightened U.S. presence may embolden the Maduro government to tighten internal controls, restrict dissent, or intensify surveillance under the justification of national defense. In fragile states, foreign pressure does not always liberate, it can harden authoritarian reflexes. The U.S. strategy, though rooted in deterrence and power projection, carries human consequences Washington cannot ignore. President Donald Trump has emphasized that the objective is pressure, not occupation, but the line between pressure and coercion is thin when aircraft capable of striking targets within minutes patrol offshore, and when electronic warfare jets map a country's defenses in real time. For Venezuelans, the distinction is academic. What they see is the world's most powerful military leaning toward their shores. And this raises a broader question: can such a display restore stability, or does it risk triggering exactly the instability it seeks to prevent? The answer may depend not on aircraft carriers or bombers, but on how fear shapes decisions among leaders, soldiers, and civilians whose futures hang in the balance. The Caribbean now stands at a crossroads, suspended between deterrence and danger, between strategic clarity and volatile ambiguity. As the Gerald Ford strike group presses closer and U.S. aircraft weave deliberate paths near Venezuelan territory, the hemisphere feels the weight of a story still unfolding, one whose ending remains unwritten. In Washington, President Donald Trump frames the deployment as a necessary measure to reassert American prestige and restore regional balance. In Caracas, the Maduro government interprets every movement as a tightening vice. Between these poles lies a stretch of ocean where misinterpretation could ignite consequences neither side intends. The unfolding situation resembles a slow-building storm. Each military movement, Super Hornet incursions, Growler electronic scans, B-52 presence flights, Triton surveillance passes adds another current to a developing front. None of these actions alone signals imminent war. Together, however, they shape an atmosphere in which escalation becomes easier, faster, and more tempting. The Caribbean has not seen this density of American power projection in decades, and with every new maneuver, regional actors are forced to reassess their assumptions. For U.S. allies, particularly Colombia, Brazil, and smaller Caribbean nations, the Ford's presence offers reassurance that Washington has not ceded influence to Beijing, Moscow, or Tehran. Yet reassurance can morph into unease when the scale of the deployment suggests more than routine patrols. American power stabilizes, but it also disturbs, creating gravitational pull that affects domestic politics, migration patterns, and economic expectations across the region. For adversarial or watchful global powers, the signal is unmistakable. Russia, still engaged in Ukraine and eager to sustain influence over Maduro, reads the deployment as an attempt to sever one of its few remaining geopolitical footholds in the Americas. China, whose loans and investments buoy Venezuela's fragile economy, sees a strategic warning. U.S. naval projection remains capable of applying immediate pressure close to home for any partner drifting too far into Beijing's orbit. Iran, increasingly active in Latin American clandestine networks, views the operation as a challenge to its presence and potential logistical corridors. The world has reached a point where regional crises are no longer isolated. What happens in the Caribbean echoes in the Black Sea, the Red Sea, and the South China Sea. And in each of these places, the same strategic questions linger. How far can Washington stretch its military bandwidth? How effectively can it deter multiple adversaries at once? And how does a show of force abroad reshape perceptions of American resolve at home? Inside Venezuela, Maduro's circle tries to weaponize the moment for internal cohesion. State media broadcast images of U.S. ships as evidence of foreign aggression, hoping to spark nationalist sentiment. But beneath this posture lies quiet concern. The flights over the Gulf exposed vulnerabilities. The carrier's proximity exposes more. And the regime understands that even without a shot fired, America can tighten financial, political, and military pressure simply by maintaining its position. Yet despite the sharp tension, something remains unresolved. The U.S. has demonstrated capability, reach, and readiness, but not intent. Venezuela has responded with rhetoric, but not retaliation. The region watches, breath held, for the gesture that will reveal whether this buildup is a deterrent, a preparation, or a prelude. For now, the story ends at the waterline, where American fighters carve arcs across the sky, and Venezuelan radar operators track shadows they can barely counter. Nothing is fixed, nothing is final, and the hemisphere stands in the fragile space between confrontation and restraint. In the end, one question rises above the noise of engines and politics as pressure mounts, and great powers circle the Caribbean. Is the world witnessing the prevention of a crisis or the quiet birth of one? The situation in the Caribbean has escalated sharply following a series of coordinated U.S. military maneuvers near Venezuelan territory. Two Super Hornets penetrated deep into the Gulf of Venezuela, while EA-18G Growlers and an MQ-4C Triton conducted electronic surveillance and reconnaissance, signaling a sophisticated U.S. intelligence operation. The movements coincide with the arrival of the USS Gerald Ford, America's most advanced aircraft carrier, whose deployment places overwhelming air and naval power within immediate reach of Venezuelan shores. Meanwhile, the appearance of B-52 bombers adds a wider global dimension, reflecting classic U.S. signaling patterns used during crises in Ukraine, the Middle East, and the Indo-Pacific. The buildup heightens tensions across Latin America as governments weigh the risks of miscalculation, escalation, and humanitarian fallout. For Venezuelans already facing economic collapse and displacement, the presence of American military assets introduces new layers of fear and uncertainty. For Washington, the operation demonstrates strategic resolve and hemispheric dominance. For global powers, it raises concerns about shifting U.S. priorities in a fractured world. As signals intensify without clear explanation, a pivotal question remains: is the US preventing instability or edging closer to a confrontation that could reshape the